Heartless, Forbidden, Book 1. Written by Suzana Thompson. Narrated by Paulina Schubert. Chapter 11. The decorator showed me some great options when I told her my idea for the room, but it wasn't as much fun as it would have been with a friend there to get excited about it with me. It was also still difficult to think of it as my room. Just the bathroom alone was nearly the size of my bedroom in our apartment. It was so extravagant that it had a shower separate from the bathtub. I had never dreamed of having my own bathroom, but it was nice knowing I wouldn't have to share one with Cade. He wouldn't be pounding on the door and yelling for me to hurry up so that he could take his shower. I'd never actually dealt with that kind of thing since I was an only child, but I had seen it in movies. Mom and I were considerate of each other about taking turns and leaving the bathroom tidy after our showers, but I imagined that Cade would leave his used towels on the floor, and maybe even drop his dirty laundry everywhere. He had probably never had to pick up after himself in his life. I imagined him carelessly leaving behind messes for the servants to clean up. He had made fun of the messiness in my room, but his undoubtedly spotless room couldn't be attributed to him but to his servants. It was easy to keep everything looking perfect if other people did the work for you. I'd like to see how his room would look if he had to clean it himself. It would probably be a worse mess than mine. Once I moved in here, though, I would keep my things in order. It would be a shame to leave such a fine room in disarray, especially after it was newly redecorated. I stood in silent contemplation after the decorator left to finalize my choices with Robert. It felt peaceful in here and isolated from the outside world. In our apartment building, I was more aware of the other people living there. I'd hear them in the hallway or the occasional sound of music or noise from the surrounding apartments. Here there was silence and a lot of space to myself. The view of the sprawling green lawn through the large windows added to the secluded feeling of the place. No neighboring houses were visible from my vantage point, and I wondered how far back the property stretched. A chain-link fence had separated my grandma's small backyard from that of the neighbor behind her, and the houses on either side of her were set even closer together, with only the driveways and narrow patches of grass separating them. I had been comfortable in that neighborhood, though, because it was where I had grown up. It was home in a way that our apartment wasn't, because it lacked the familiarity of my old neighborhood. I had known all my neighbors and played with their kids. There had been a connection there to my dad that made me feel like I belonged there. I had none of that at the apartment, so it still felt like just a temporary place after over a year of living there. I had made no effort to settle in and get to know any of my neighbors. I couldn't imagine ever feeling like I belonged here either, but I would enjoy this beautiful view of the grounds while I was here. That and the silence would be the best perks of living here. I had never experienced this much quiet before. Reluctantly pulling myself out of this tranquil oasis, I turned away from the window and was startled to see Cade leaning in the doorway of the room. His right shoulder was propped against the door jamb, and his hands were in the pockets of his basketball shorts in a pose that made him look like he had been there a while. I wanted to snap at him about watching me like a creeper, but this was his house. "I'm leaving," I volunteered instead. "How?" he asked. I frowned at the question. Jenna had been my ride, but he had chased her off. It was much too far to walk since it was quite a distance even by car. I'll see if..." He cut off my uncertain response. "I'll drive you. I just wanted to see if you would ask me, but you would rather ask anyone else but me. I still don't know what your problem is with me. What did I ever do to you?" "You mean besides insulting my mom, cheating on my best friend, and knocking me down in a parking lot?" I retorted. "I'm talking about before that," he replied. "You already had a problem with me before you even met me. Also, it wasn't cheating, since I never even went on one date with Skylar. I didn't even kiss her or anything. All we did was talk. We weren't together, so how is that cheating?" "You asked her out," I argued. "And the date never happened," he countered. "Because you cheated," I insisted. "Not by myself," he said. The truth of that statement took the fight out of me. What Kate had done to Skylar was rotten, but what I had done was worse. She had been just another girl to him, but she had been my best friend. How could I do that to her? Cade made a sound of disgust. "You look like somebody died. The two of you are both being ridiculous. Get over it already. You're making a big deal over one kiss." I flushed at his mention of it. Although he didn't seem to be talking about how that kiss had affected me, that's where my mind went. I remembered how good it had felt, and recalling the way I had responded to him was humiliating. His lips curved into a smirk as he watched me. Maybe it was a big deal to you. My face flamed even more as he mocked me. You don't even think of me that way, he said as he stepped closer. That's what you said right before you kissed me. You kissed me, I corrected with what little defense I had as I moved back from him. You kissed me back, he taunted. What's the matter, Lexi? Am I turning you on again? He stepped back into my personal space. You're turning my stomach, I retorted. Get away from me, I demanded, and pushed him away. Maybe you want to finish what we started, he continued. Come to my room and you can ride me all day. Despite my annoyance and embarrassment, I found it curious that his offer of sex involved leaving this room. He had no problem suggesting it in such a crude way, but he had some kind of problem with doing it here. We were in a bedroom with a bed that could be used immediately, but he wanted to go somewhere else. I saw an opportunity to turn the tables on him. I can't wait, I told him in a seductive tone and grabbed his hand to pull him toward the bed. I want to ride you right now. He yanked his hand out of my grasp and scowled at me. Stop playing games. I laughed at him. Are you really that germophobic? That girl hasn't been here in how long, and you're still grossed out by her bed? 3 years, he supplied, but that's not the point. Anyone can walk in here since it's not occupied yet. Nobody will come into my room without knocking. I ignored his explanation because I knew that wasn't the real reason. He'd shown distaste for this room when he told me to gut it. 3 years, I stressed. You sure hold a grudge. I have no grudge against that girl, he denied. My father was the one who gave her this room. As if she could ever be his daughter, he remarked in disdain. I was still contemplating the significance of that when Kate snapped at me. Do you want me to drive you home or not? Yeah, I answered without hesitation, because I did need a ride home and didn't really want to bother Robert about it. But only because you scared Jenna off, I added. That was really rude, by the way. Let me see how polite you are when I bring your ex here, he said as he followed me out to the hallway. He had a point, but it was hard to imagine that he could have had his heart broken the way I had. It was nearly impossible to imagine him being in love with anyone. There was no hint of tenderness to him at all, and I could only picture him as the heartbreaker in a romantic situation. Jenna was the only one showing any emotional pain. Kate just appeared to be angry rather than upset. He got ahead of me after we descended the staircase. This way. He led me back into a different section of the house, and into a garage that was bigger than a dealer's showroom. I gaped at all the cars. What does your dad do? Kate answered me in a tone that sounded like he was marveling over something. You really don't know? No, I responded absently as I took in the magnificence of the room. It was the brightest and cleanest garage I had ever seen. There was no cheap paneling here. It had solid walls, a vaulted ceiling, and the floor was as shiny as the cars. More than anything else I had seen in the mansion, this room conveyed how wealthy this family was. Only people with an enormous amount of money would spend so much of it on a luxurious place to park their cars. He's in business, Kate told me. Business must be good, I commented dryly. Yeah, it is, he agreed. I was in a daze as I followed him to his car. For the first time, I understood why he had wanted my mom to sign a prenup, and why he had so easily suggested $1 million settlement. His garage probably cost more than my grandma's house, and that thought was making my head spin. A freaking garage! What's wrong with you? Kate demanded. I shook my head, as if that could clear it out of the surreal realization it just had. It's too much. What is? He asked in his impatient, uncaring way. I gave my head another shake. It's all too much. If he had any interest in my response, I had apparently used up his patience. Get in, he ordered as he pulled open his door. I slowly opened the passenger door and sat down in the seat. Your car lives better than most people. What are you talking about? Kate snapped. You sound crazy. This whole place is crazy, I exclaimed. Who has a garage like this? What are you so upset about? He questioned. I thought you'd be happy to see this. The last one loved it. I guess it turned her on, because I caught her here with the gardener's son. He was fucking her on the hood of Dad's Jag, and Dad was not happy about it. He blamed the guy, of course, because he refused to see that she wasn't as innocent as he thought she was. Was he banned from visiting her here? I asked, thinking that Robert sounded like an overprotective dad. Yes, Cade confirmed. He got his dad fired, so I think his dad was pissed at him too. Robert fired him? I questioned in dismay. That's not fair. You can't blame him for something his son did. He was new, Cade said dismissively. Our old gardener was with us a long time before he retired. We have to be able to trust the people who work for us. If they respect us, we respect them. If not, then they don't belong here. They were reminded of that when Dad fired the new gardener. That's harsh, I said. It's business, he replied. You have to make decisions like that when you're the boss. But this isn't a job, I argued. It's his home. And the guy didn't even do anything wrong. He can't control what his son does. My dad doesn't want people like that around his family. Protecting his family comes first, and running an estate is like running a business, he explained. You have to be in control of your employees. They have to know the rules and be professional, and they can't bring their family drama to work. What would happen if you screwed some guy where your mom works? He stumped me with that question. Well, I don't think she would get fired for it, I hedged, although I could imagine what a bad impression it would leave with her employer. You probably shouldn't test it out, Kate advised. But I guess it doesn't matter anymore. She's already given her notice. What do you mean? I inquired in alarm. He smirked at me. Didn't she tell you she's quitting her job? I thought you and your mom were so close. Oh, come on, he exclaimed irritably as I stared at him. You can't think she'd still be a waitress after she married my dad. Wake up, Lexi. But what will she do all day? I wondered aloud. Cade shrugged. Probably go to charity luncheons. I huffed at him and turned my attention to putting on my seatbelt. My mom would need more to occupy her time than luncheons, but arguing with him about it would be pointless. He started the car and pressed a button to open one of the garage doors. We pulled out into the driveway and circled to the front of the house and down the long stretch to the street. One thing that had surprised me was that there was no gate. Anyone could drive onto the property. I thought you'd have a gate, I mentioned to Kate as he drove onto the street. Dad wants to live like a regular person, he replied. He says that we can call the police just like anyone else if they had to. Regular people don't live in mansions, I pointed out. Right, Kate agreed, but Dad likes to pretend he's just a regular guy. I think that's the reason he doesn't date women with money. He doesn't want some heiress to ruin his image. Robert did give the impression of being a regular guy. If I hadn't heard the gossip at school about Cade being rich, I wouldn't have guessed that his dad was a wealthy man when my mom introduced me to him. He was so nice and down to earth and didn't behave at all like an entitled person. But now I'd heard about a different side of him that troubled me. It seemed to me that he had been harsh and unfair when he fired his gardener. Those actions fit the stereotype I had of a demanding, unreasonable rich person. He hadn't shown that side of himself to Mom, and I wondered if I should tell her about it. I only knew of this one incident, and that wasn't enough to turn her against him. It wasn't enough to turn me against him either, but it had tarnished the wonderful impression I had of him. I didn't want to spoil Mom's image of him, too. He had done this before she ever met him, so I decided to leave it in the past. She had spent so much more time with him than I had, and she must have seen how he treated his servants. Mom wouldn't have overlooked bad behavior from him, so he must have been decent to his staff. You drive a long way to school every day, I commented to Cade. It's mostly on highway, he replied, so it's not bad. Isn't there a public high school in your neighborhood? I inquired. There is, but Dad wanted me to get away from that crowd, he explained. He thinks they party too much. He doesn't think that kids at our school party? I asked wryly. Not to this level of excess, he said. He really doesn't know anything about the kids you go to school with, I remarked in a dry tone. They do party more than he knows, Kate agreed, but they don't have the money to get into the kind of trouble my old friends did. I scoffed at that. People at our school buy drugs too. It's not something only rich people can afford. Drugs aren't the only way to party, he told me. There's alcohol too, I acknowledged. Yeah, sure you can afford the expensive stuff, but people get just as drunk off the cheap stuff. But your dad might be right. You probably don't drink the cheap stuff, so you don't party like you did at your old school. I don't party like I used to, he confirmed, but it has nothing to do with alcohol. Drugs? I questioned in a hushed tone by the seriousness of the subject. Addiction could lead to death, so I sided with Robert on this one. Yet, drugs were everywhere, and simply changing schools wouldn't solve his son's drug problem. Cade had never appeared high to me, but I was no expert on the effects of drugs. I wasn't a stranger to underage drinking, but I had never tried any illegal drugs, not even pot. The thought of getting high was scary to me, although I suppose the buzz I got from alcohol was also a drug-induced high. Alcohol just seemed like a safer drug, even though I knew that it could be just as big of an addiction as other drugs. I always limited myself to 2 drinks because I preferred a pleasant buzz over getting drunk. You can't do drugs and play basketball, Cade said. I won't do anything that can screw up my game, and my dad knows that. I was relieved that he didn't have a drug addiction, but I was also confused about why Robert worried about Cade's partying then. It wasn't drugs, and you said it wasn't alcohol. What else is left? Cade glanced at me. You really can't guess? It was his smirk that gave me the answer, but I was still just as confused, and I didn't want to say the word to Cade. He spoke it for me. Sex. That was my favorite way to party. But how can he stop you, I wondered, if you're with your girlfriend, and I trailed off as I pondered the logistics. They would need a place to be alone, but I couldn't imagine that Cade wouldn't be able to manage that. They weren't my girlfriends, he replied. I hired escorts. My dad found out when he saw the charges on his credit card statement. I stared at him as I tried to figure out if he was just saying that to shock me. He had spoken in a factual tone, like he was telling me about making a normal purchase. His manner was so confusing when he said such things without any inflection in his voice. I didn't know what to think. Was he telling me the truth or some outrageous lie? I decided to try to trip him up. They didn't care that you were a kid? They thought my dad was hiring them for my first time, he answered. I wasn't the first 15-year-old to get a present like that from his old man. I just had several first times before my dad found out and cut me off from everything. I wasn't allowed to see my friends anymore, and he even transferred me to a new school. I thought you got kicked out of your old school, I said while grappling with the possibility that his story was true. That's the rumor I spread to sound badass at my new school, he explained. And I also needed a reason for transferring to a public school. I was still unsure whether to believe him. You haven't gotten into any trouble since then? No, he stated, because Dad told me he'd put me in military school if I did. He said that I could choose to become a real man on my own, or he would make sure that I did. Escorts? I finally questioned in dismay. Why would you need... I trailed off and began again. I mean, didn't you have a girlfriend? I recalled that he certainly hadn't had any difficulties in finding girlfriends at our school. Yes, I did, he stated, but we hadn't had sex. One of my friends told me about his dad surprising him with an escort for his birthday, and I decided I wanted one too. This conversation was surreal to me. But you said there were several. Once wasn't enough, he remarked. After I had it, I wanted more. That's terrible, I told him. You were cheating on your girlfriend. Interesting, he said. You're more concerned with me cheating on my girlfriend than me hiring hookers. That's terrible too, I said belatedly. What's so terrible about it? He asked. Well, you're buying people, I replied. That's wrong. No, he countered, I was buying sex. That's a service, not a person. A service? I exclaimed. It's supposed to be a connection between 2 people. I paid for sex, he retorted, which is what they were selling. I wasn't looking for a connection, and they weren't either. They were just doing their jobs, like you do. You don't make a connection with your customers. That's different, I argued. I'm not being intimate with them. I'm just selling them food. I shouldn't have to explain the difference to you. A job's a job, he stated. I couldn't believe that he equated sex with fast food. How could it be that meaningless to him? I had been so upset when I found out that Lucas had used me, but now I felt so empty to think that it might have meant absolutely nothing to him. I thought that he at least remembered it as a shared intimacy between us, even if he had dumped me. But Cade's revelation had made me realize that it probably had no significance to him at all. What was your first time like? Cade asked me at that moment. None of your business, I told him. Maybe it will be, he said in an enigmatic tone. I had no idea what he meant by that, and I had no interest in trying to decipher it. If I had momentarily forgotten about my initial negative impression of Cade, this conversation had just reminded me. He didn't take other people's feelings into account, because he didn't have any himself. People had no more value to him than the services they could provide for him. I was doubly glad that I had destroyed his chances with Skylar, even if she hated me for it, because Cade was worse than I had originally thought he was. Conversely, I no longer hated him. Maybe because I shared in the blame, or maybe because I was discovering how truly messed up he was. Robert thought that he had fixed the problem by getting his son away from his old friends, but they weren't the problem. The problem was with Cade himself, and I wasn't sure if anything could be done about it.